Thank you, Asia. Well, now I think we're all reminded why we love teaching Stanford students. It's that kind of engagement. Well, I'm delighted to be here for this 35th anniversary of Stanford Center for Teaching and Learning. The notion that we could have a faculty who would be both great researchers and great teachers goes back to the early days of the university. And in fact, David Starr Jordan himself embraced this. And in writing letters to colleagues, enticing them to come to California, he wrote, "Mr. Stanford wants me to get the best. He wants no ornamental or idle professors." And I think we've never been a place that's had ornamental or idle professors. And if you don't have enough to do, go see the provost and he'll give you some assignments. I think 119 years later, we still celebrate that incredible joy that comes from having colleagues who are both great teachers and great researchers. And for 35 years, this center has really changed what we've been able to do. I think, as Michelle said, David's vision in creating this center and in leading it in the early days was absolutely instrumental. But Michelle thanks so many people. I want to say a special thanks to Michelle, whose incredible leadership of this center has made such a difference. I can tell you not only has my own teaching benefited, but as a department chair and dean, the number of faculty colleagues who have found this center to be a vital resource has been immeasurable. And I think many of our faculty really transformed their teaching with the help from the center. And I think that's really what it's all about in the end. Looking at these posters up here and the roster of faculty and looking around the room, I see many of Stanford's most distinguished teachers. But there are also individuals who've won Nobel Prizes, won Pulitzer Prizes, and even have talk shows on the radio, which tells you, and popular books on the New York Times bestseller list. It's a real indication of the versatility and capability of our faculty. Collectively, these faculty reflect the excellence and range of talents that makes Stanford such a special place, attracts great students, and makes it such a joy to teach them. Through this lecture series, I think the center enables all of us to learn about different techniques that we can use in our own classrooms. So it is an honor and privilege to introduce the center's 100th award-winning teacher on teaching, Harry Elam Jr. Harry's been a distinguished member of the Stanford faculty since 1990. He is a scholar of African American drama and an award winner, having won 6 teaching awards, including the Humanities and Sciences Dean's Distinguished Teaching Award and a Bing Teaching Fellowship for Undergraduate Education. He's also, by the way, I should point out, a killer director. And if you ever have an opportunity to see a play that Harry is directing, don't miss the chance. His version of Rent that he did on campus, that starred, I think he was a physics major, wasn't he, Harry? Starred a physics major in the male lead, was incredible. I told him after it was better than the version I had seen in San Francisco, which is a tribute not only to his directing skills, but of course our incredible students. Harry is the Olive H. Palmer Professor in the Humanities and the Robert and Ruth Halpern University Fellow. And this summer, of course, he accepted, as Michelle said, his new role as the Freeman Thornton Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education. I'm delighted he's agreed to take on this challenge. His dedication and vision for undergraduate education are unsurpassed, and our students will be the beneficiaries. 3 years ago, in an interview with the Association for Theater in Higher Education, Harry was asked about his thoughts on balancing research and teaching, and his response was telling. He said, "I love teaching. Classes can be incredibly informative. I'm so grateful to a class that shaped my August Wilson book, for example. They were critical to shaping what I had to say. Class experience can really shape ideas." And when he was asked at the close of the interview if he had any last thoughts, he said, "The only thing I want to say is that I wouldn't want to be doing any other job. to be able not only to practice, but also to be able to think about what it means in society and write about it and teach it. That's good stuff. We are certainly glad that he is not doing any other job at any other university. And I can think of no one better to give the 100th lecture in this series of award-winning teachers. This is actually the second time Harry has been featured in this series. The first time was 15 years ago, when we were all much younger, when he talked about the difficulties and benefits of encouraging diversity and diverse views in the classroom. Today he'll share his thoughts on Is the Lecture Dead?, the large lecture course in the Humanities today. And I have no doubt that he will share some good stuff. Please join me in welcoming Harry.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, President Hennessy, for those remarks. I'm sort of worried now. If I do direct another play, you all expect many things. So luckily, I won't be doing it for a while, being in this job. But I also wanted to say that I'm incredibly honored to be the 100th lecturer in this CTL series and be here on the 35th anniversary. Let me also take this opportunity to honor the award-winning teachers in attendance today. Could you all please stand, the award-winning, probably all the audience in a sense would stand. Could you stand really quickly? Thank you. So please accept our appreciation and thanks for all of your efforts. You have shown through what you do in the classroom that good teaching can work hand in hand, and as the president said, inform great scholarship. That here at Stanford, an emphasis on classroom teaching is not antithetical, but central to the core mission of the university. I would also like to take the opportunity to speak English, to congratulate CTL. Since I've been the VP UE, I have had the opportunity to learn up close and personal what a jewel CTL is at Stanford. Here at CTL, for undergraduate and graduate students, postdocs, and faculty, the focus is on the intersection between learning and teaching and how best to make the classroom encounter all the more meaningful and memorable. Their efforts have changed faculty lives, as the president said, and faculty members discovered that CTL early on, for that matter, at any point in their career, can be attuned to the kind of magic that can transpire in the student-teacher exchange that Aisha spoke about, and can enhance hundreds, if even thousands of careers over its time. So to CTL, for all you do, a hearty congratulations. I also want to echo what the president said about Michelle, that Michelle isn't truly special. And as you all know, she is the force behind the success and achievement of recent years of CTL. Her passion for teaching and learning, her commitment to Stanford and to Stanford faculty and students have been a major factor in CTL and its growth and evolution over the years. As you all probably know, Michelle is a leader nationally and even internationally in this field. And this recognition has only helped to further her reputation at CTL as a model for others to emulate. So we thank you, Michelle, for your commitment, for your vision, for your leadership. Most particularly to anyone who has worked with Michelle, they know also of her goodwill and kind spirit. Michelle cares, and it shows. So on this day, Michelle, we toast and thank you for all you've done and all you do for CTL and Stanford. So, my talk today is about whether the lecture in humanity is dead and the value of a lecture as a mode of knowledge production in the humanities. To be sure, the irony of this is not lost on me, or I'm sure not on you, right? Here I am giving a lecture on whether the lecture is dead. Now, it's driven in part by my work at the VPUE and the ongoing questions that are being asked by the Seuss study of undergraduate education at Stanford. So part of the rationale for Seuss has been the mantra that the world has changed and students have changed, and we need to think about the methodology for teaching the new learner. we must think how best to educate these millennials, as they've been called, or net generation, as short for internet, right? And about what is required. So one of the factors is how we move to differently approach the subject. How do we teach differently? And I was reminded of a comment by Pat Burkett in the back. She was talking about a faculty member who said to her, I don't understand. My teaching evaluations are going down, and I'm doing the same thing that I did for 10 years. And that sense there that somehow we have to understand and think differently about what we do and who this new learner is. And that subject of the new learner is something I'm going to return to a little bit later in my discussion today. Another factor in my choice of subject was a general concern with humanities and humanities education. As we know here at Stanford, as well as at greater colleges and universities across the nation, education in humanities is suffering with declining numbers. Fewer students major or take humanities courses. Students come into college more than ever vocationally driven, with business being the largest major nationwide. And the economic crisis in some state schools have in fact forced them or compelled them to cut back in their offerings in the humanities. At Stanford, some 10% of students graduate with degrees in humanities. The recent WASP study they studied intensely the class of 2012, and as they looked at that class, they found that the incoming class of 2012, top 10 majors, humanities wasn't there. Nowhere to be seen in it. So what we do know, however, even as we give that fact, that the fact that there's no correlation, in a sense, to career and what potentially you major in. More than that, what I would say is that now, more than ever, the humanities are critical to our social order and our survival. Stanford, as the president has noted, has more departments in the top 10 in the humanities than it ever had before, one of them being drama, I'm very proud to say. So what we are doing is making students, and what we need to do is make students understand the significance of the humanities, to keep them not only in our courses, but to encourage them to major in the humanities. So how are we going to grow this number? How are we going to cultivate the interest in the humanities? Within these questions and this problem of humanities education certainly is the matter of the lecture. Given the current intellectual and cultural context, is the lecture still a viable means for the humanities to engage critical subject matter, to encourage student thinking, to investigate humanistic problems? So, the disciplinary relevance of the lecture within the humanities serves as another reason for my choice of this subject today. The third and final reason deals with my own pedagogical interest in the lecture as a form of delivery. This is driven by my experiences past and present. My first course taught out of graduate school was a lecture of some 300 people. It was a lecture I taught at the University of Maryland, and I taught this course called The Introduction to Theater. And those in theater department knows that at state school, part of the bread and butter is FTE, having full-time enrollment in classes, and the things that packed them in was intro to theater because students thought it was easy. So I taught courses of 300 students, and I taught them back to back. So I taught one class, I taught the other. The good thing about it is that I found out which jokes worked, and I was ready. My timing got a little better in terms of that. It was very instructive. So now in my first year as vice provost, I'm also teaching a lecture course again, this time with the beautiful and talented Dr. Michelle Elam, a IHOM course called Beyond Survival. So how does the form evolve over that time? It's some 20 years, actually 25 years in terms of that. What can an instructor do today to improve the lecture? Is it a lost cause? Can you enliven a morose or dated or deadly form that is potentially the lecture? So with this rationale in mind, I come before you today to lecture on humanities lecturing. The argument I intend to put forward in answer to the question of death and the lecture's demise is that I think it's potentially premature. Rather, that the lecture still has a utility within the humanities, and yet, in order for it to inform, and to do that function, we as instructors need to recognize its limitations as well as its utilities. All the while finding ways to reinvent the form, to reinvigorate it with relevance for our students. So, how do you make the most of lectures? How do you make them effective? How do you motivate students in the system to dig deeper into subject matter? Here, and how do you garner the sense that you are doing something within the course? Well, the sense that you can learn from CTL we've expressed, and CTL becomes an important resource in terms of thinking this. One of the things that I learned in sort of looking back at the research in and about lectures is the first thing you need to do is you need to garner the students' attention, draw them in, and create an environment that's conducive to their learning. My experience with this, again, goes back to my Maryland days. As I mentioned to you, I was coming into that experience having not lectured before and not knowing, in a sense, what to do, and not having the experience in graduate school of being in that environment. So what did I do? I turned to the senior faculty there. And one of those senior faculty members, a guy named Ron O'Leary, the late Ron O'Leary, said to me, well, what you need to do is come to my lecture and hear me, because I'm probably the best lecturer you're going to hear. So what did I do? I went to his class, but before that I talked to students, and students verified the greatness that was Ron O'Leary. So I needed to go hear what he was doing. And one of the things that he did was that he'd start each lecture simply by pulling something from the newspaper, a story, a headline, and he would somehow weave that into his lecture, be it about Broadway, be it about minstrelsy, or whatever it was in terms of American theater. He could do it. And students sat rapt in attention at the edge of their seat, listening as he pulled them in and listening how he was going to weave that into what they were doing. So that sense of grabbing attention was something that I didn't, in terms of emulate him, but I understood the sense of the importance in terms of trying to do it. And so one of the ways that I would do it is that I would ask classes sometimes for a show of hands, at the very sense, who liked this reading? And that sense of show of hands might grab them immediately or bring them in. I also learned in my Maryland days about the importance potentially of organization and the need in it with a lecture that you need a blueprint and a ground plan for where your argument is going. And that need is expressed by our own Mariette Denman in CTL, notes that a framework for your argument is necessary in terms of students to follow. So I've developed more and more of a structure of laying out in front what the major arguments, what I'm going to do in that lecture will be, preparing the students for what is to come, and the path that I will follow. We might understand then the lecture as a 50-minute cohesive argument. And I want students to be able to understand the major points of that argument and follow it and navigate the path that I'm going to take them there. Something else informed my lecturing at Maryland, and that was the lack of intimacy in the classroom. I was in front on a platform far away, my audience unable to see the faces. And I wanted to make them feel as if I was speaking more directly to them. Moreover, outside the class, I would invariably run into students. Like I ran into this student, I was in Safeway or whatever the market back in the DC area was, and I ran into the checker said, "Hi, Dr. Elam, I'm in your class." So I said, okay, you know. And then one day, about 2 years later, I was in a bar, and a woman who was serving me, the cocktail waitress, said to me, "I was in your class of Theater 110 at Maryland. I had the biggest crush on you." And it did wonders for my ego, but it didn't do much for the date that I was with. And that was the first and last date. So I made a decision then, and they wanted to do something that, and this I think is an important battle in a sense in the lecture, is how do you make the large classroom small? And that was, I started doing exactly what I'm doing now, walking around. And that allowed me in a sense to see faces more. And then one day I took it a step further and started going up the aisles. And that changed people's attitudes. They're like, what is he going to do next? And so it got to some degree, potentially more engaged or interested. So that sense of making that large classroom small is a factor, I think, in thinking about how we lecture. And I took it, I guess, a step further in terms of that, and that I'd started memorizing students' names, that I wanted them to know that I cared about them, cared about what they were doing in the class, that they weren't an anonymous person in this class of 300 or so. I still do that today in terms of my IHUM, but as my wife points out, the memory is fading. I have senior moments. You know, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. There's those moments when, like there's a woman in the class who's British, and her name is Katie, but I heard it as KD, like K and D. And that's what I kept calling her, and the students would laugh. And I thought, they're laughing because I picked her up. I didn't see her in 2 weeks, and I knew her name right away. But no, they were laughing because I mispronounced her name. So lectures, and my lectures involve also some form of interaction. And I've learned, again, from the lecturing literature that interactivity is critical to student engagement and learning. Students rely on the expressiveness of the instructor, how they interpret your interest and passion for the material and your relation to them. So much as an actor feels the audience in the theatrical production, a lecturer needs to feel his or her audience. And I tend to ask questions so to open them up to responding to me. And they're usually open-ended questions that I know where they're going to go. So it doesn't take us off on too much of a tangent since we have 50 minutes to complete it. The sense, then, is that this interaction informs the dialogue or the discussion, and that you have to, as a lecturer, be aware of the sense of participation that's going on, that even in their inaction, students are active. You need to try to engage and feel their interest and recognize their levels of distraction or attraction. Certainly, interactivity is one way to do this, but there are other methods of creating interactivity as well. Professor Rob Reich breaks up his lectures by asking students provocative questions and asking them to inform each others and getting together in small groups over discussion. This, too, is a form of potentially breaking up and calling for reflection. And there's other models that bring about this interaction as well. For example, why don't just take a second to think. Think in your own experience what you do to make that interaction. And see, even that silence like this is the same moment of stopping students in the lecture, getting them to think, getting them to reflect, getting them somehow to re-engage in what you're doing, because they're going to drift off. So somehow, if you can make those stops to get them back, it's critical to the notion of, and that's a point I'm going to return to again and again today, this notion of getting them to stop, reflect, re-engage, potentially replenish. All the techniques that I've mentioned so far are good and fine for making lectures effective. But they beg the theatrical question, of course, of audience, and the fact that audiences respond differently. As with theatrical direction, it is most important that a lecturer recognize and know his or her audience in order to think about how that lecturer will best interact and be most particularly useful in terms of their experience within the classroom. So what then do we know about today's student audience for the humanities? These new millennial students that I mentioned earlier. To be sure, there's a myriad of scholarship already on this subject in books appearing daily. To be sure, this scholarship is full of contradictions. Well, some have argued that this generation is less literary because of their predilection for social networks, blogs, tweets, and others. Others have argued that this informs a new literacy and has new ways of not only writing, but reading. Right? While some have suggested that this is not an active or knowledgeable generation because of the information technology at their immediate disposal, others have maintained that it is exactly because of this overload of information that the net generation has, as a result, become more astute, more knowledgeable, and necessarily more discerning in their ability to filter information, albeit sometimes the wrong information. Certainly, one of the things we need to do is be careful of stereotyping, and how we think about this generation needs to allow for differences according to race, gender, sexuality, class, and even more on an individual basis. My daughter, for example, does not text or play video games, but still I would put her right within that generation. So what can we say then about this generation? How can we note this generation's experiences and expectations in terms of education? And how have they been shaped by technology? They are more familiar with current technologies, certainly, than their instructors. I remember when PowerPoint first came in, that my slides for PowerPoint were done by my third grade, at that point, daughter, who knew how to do the transition certainly better than I did. So this generation, its lifetime, has learned on large part through processes of interactive involvement with information and has a positive sense of the power of information to impact thought and impact potentially change. So what does this say then about the need of technology in the humanistic lecture? Now, you may have noticed that today I have no PowerPoint slides. Yeah, low tech, purposefully to think about that very question and what it does. I mean, PowerPoint has definitely become, as we all know, ubiquitous. common. And I do use it more generally in terms of lectures. And one of the things that it does potentially is allow for that sense of organization and flow to show the outline of the class there. They get it. Also showing pictures and moving images is something that goes back to that idea of stopping and allowing students to re-engage in some ways. And interesting in terms of data from someone looking at the lecture in history and looking at its use of photo images, found that students' retention was better when you used images. So there's some benefit then, right, to this idea of engaging in that way. But for me to use another theatrical metaphor, the use of PowerPoint often functions as a prop, as just a backdrop. It doesn't change the dynamics of what's happening in that interaction between student and professor. And that's what I'm really interested in. What technology can do that? And how can technology bring that about? So one of the things that we're doing now and just begun in the VPUE is starting a new initiative that looks at technology in the classroom and starts to think about the ways that we can change potentially that interaction. And one of the things about that is that we're interested in spaces and places where technology informs what you're doing in terms of your research as well as in terms of your teaching. Can there be points where the two of those come together? That's going to be really potentially exciting for you and for the student. I'm thinking here of something like the spatial history lab, where the work there is such that the teacher in the class there or working in the lab is Zephyr Frank as well as Richard White. And Richard White said that in terms of the work he was doing there, it not only changed the way he does research, it changes the way he teaches. So can we find other examples in terms of that will work in terms of how we approach the subject of research and the dynamic of research and teaching? Also, in terms of the notion of technology and working on it, we've formed on the undergraduates a new committee called the Student Advisory Group, or SAG. I thought that was clever. You could think of also the Screen Actors Guild, right? It goes with that, right? But anyway, in terms of them, we wanted their opinions on, among other things, thinking about technology. And one of the technologies they mentioned was texting. To use that in the classroom. They thought texting might be something that would work, and did work. So they would come into class. I mean, they do it anyway, right? So, and why not use it? So they would text, and the text would be in response to a teacher's question, and then it would be flashed up on the screen in terms of the background, in terms of the professor, to see what the answers were, and you could relate your answer to the person's next to you. But whatever the technology is, I think, and one of the lessons, too, that we have to think about is technology needs to go with pedagogy. So it's not simply about the technology and what the technology does, it's how it's informed by certain pedagogy. By that I mean the questions that you ask students to respond to, the way you get them potentially to interact after you ask that question, and what they do. And that, again, allows for that idea that I mentioned before of stopping, thinking, reflecting, and re-engaging in a variety of ways. So that's something that, that we have to think about, even as we think about the potentials for new technology. Implicit here also, with the notion of millennial students and of this net generation, is that they potentially learn differently. They function through discovery and interactive involvement with information. They shift attention spans more rapidly. They prefer more visual learning. They multitask constantly. And this is normal for them. As you probably know, our colleague Cliff Nass may have shown their inability to do this effectively, right? But they still do it. My wife and I tried to show this to our daughter, but she was too busy doing her homework while listening to her iPod and watching a movie on her computer. So anyway, that idea of multitasking is something that we have to deal with. So part of the problem now, potentially in terms of the lecture, is that students are going to get distracted, but potentially now they have more that can distract them. Or in front of them, they have the laptop. And the laptop in the classroom is something I think we're going to keep coming back to. It's something that emeritus faculty David Abernathy came to me really concerned about in terms of the lecture. And I know that some have gone as far as to say no laptops in lectures. Others have said that you can't have your laptop unless you're in the back row. In the case of my wife and I in our class, we say that laptops need to be turned strictly to notes within the class. You can't have any internet on. I know at MIT they have switches. you can turn on and off in classrooms to just eliminate and that's an idea there. But it's something, I think, in terms of that we're going to have to come back to and think about. The implication is today's students learn differently and have shorter attention spans, that they cannot be asked to follow, therefore, a lecture. They cannot possibly follow a sustained humanities argument over 50 minutes. So, therefore, the form is dead. But let's follow this logic then with an example from the arts. If we allow that, the sense that given the musical what is that word? Musical likes of our class of, say, 2013, or the sense of how we appreciate and understand classical music, we could argue then that the symphony is dead, right? But we know, and those of us who are going to look and be at the opening of the Bing Concert Hall in 2013 recognize that in there are going to be incredible performances by Stanford students. Like, for example, some 89 students auditioned in terms of musical ability at Stanford are in this year's class and have a profound, in a sense, musical talent in terms of classical music. So we know that they can be taught. We know that we can teach it. It's about how we do it and how we bring them potentially to that subject. So let's follow this analogy then to this next generation in terms of their ability and place and space of the argument in terms of the lecture. Here I want to use another metaphor from the arts, and that is contemporary ballet. Relying on the sensibilities of today and movements garnered from more current dance theater practices, contemporary ballet is still ballet. It is still grounded in classical ballet techniques, repertoires, toes, and carries and training. But the form has evolved. So can we follow this analogy out then with the humanities lecture? That is a form that needs and must evolve. Even as teachers and students, we can figure a way to sustain an argument and foreground the impact of this convention that is the form. But that also we need to find ways to incorporate new technologies, new spaces for learning, new student pedagogies that allow for time within the lecture to reflect and to re-engage, and that enable interaction with the information from new and different dependencies of communication and new use of visuality. Can we get to there in terms of the lecture and create a new space for it to make the lecture evolve in a way in terms of the humanities? Yet, even as I propose this reimagining of the humanities lecture, a nagging question remains, and it involves my return to the subject matter of the position of the humanities that I mentioned at the outset. And this is the question of whether or not the current state of humanities in the public imagination is the lecture the best method for carrying humanities content in academia. Virtually from its inception, the hierarchical nature of the lecture has been attacked. Critics have exhaled it ethically and morally as bankrupt form that depends on the notion of an expert, a sage, a guru who passively transmits pearls of knowledge to neophytes who passively absorb it. Now, the key word here, of course, is passive, and the sense of passive learning that happens, as literature has talked about in the lecture. In 1931, Hamilton Holt, then president of Rollins College, told a national conference of academics that, quote, the lecture method was probably the worst possible scheme ever devised for imparting knowledge. Well, he argued on that, quote, the mysterious process by means of which the contents of the professor's notebooks are transferred by means of the fountain pen to the pages of the student's notebook without passing through the mind of either. So the concern then and now with the humanities lecture is a question of whether it can produce thought and critical thinking, even if passivity and passive learning is inherent to the form. Now, Donald A. Blight, in his classic book on lecturing entitled What's the Use of Lectures?, argues in the introduction that one should rely on lectures, quote, to teach information. Do not rely on them to promote thought, to change attitudes, or develop behavioral skills if you can help it. I was reading this, I was depressed. It's like, wow, isn't that exactly the subject matter of the humanities lecture? Aren't we as humanists all the more interested and engaged in not simply dispensing information, but challenging the values and assumptions of our students and getting them to think critically through lectures. Are lectures then doomed? And is this thus the demise of the humanities inevitably simply because the form cannot support humanistic inquiry? So here I speak with the advantage of someone who has taught IHUM on and off for some 10 years now. I taught the first IHUM class. I was the director at that point, and I guess it was like the director being like that guy who is the hair club for men. He's not only the client, you know, he's a... Anyway, so I had to be that guy. And so we taught a course called Why Read It? And the students at that point, since there was no other IHUM, they thought it was remedial. You know, why read it? But nonetheless, in my experience of IHUM, I had the experience of teaching a phenomenal class with two incredible teachers, and that was Josh Landy and Andrea Nightingale in a class called The Good Life. And there, what I saw in their ability in that class was to present a philosophical argument in ways that would engage those students, get them to think, provoke them to come to them with questions. And they had to follow the argument on its root in ways that had surprises, in ways that had new meanings, in ways that, yes, impelled thought. Invariably, at the end of each of those lectures, there was a coterie of students wrapped around Andrea or around Josh. And it was a powerful sense to see that. And you see the same thing, I think, in Asia, talking about what Lanier did in terms of that class and what could happen in that class. So that's the sense, to me, that can happen and does happen and needs to happen, in a sense, in a humanities lecture. So while I don't have the quantitative evidence of Don Bly, I have that anecdotal evidence that I've seen over the years, and I know that certain things are possible in the sense of what can happen in terms of a lecture. Now, often this doesn't just happen in the lecture. It needs reinforcement. So that means outside of it, it means the discussion section. It means that somehow the students have to carry it out. It means today potentially blogs, wikis, other things that reinforce the argument that's going on there and makes that happen in sense and in other ways, that gives that feedback, that makes time. But it also is about professors and professors connecting in ways that allow for deep thinking and push beyond this notion of passive learning. So my evidence suggests that the humanities have the potential not only to make students understand the text within the humanities are not closed systems, but open to different interpretations, but that these lectures can also open up questions that relate to the students and make them think about their social, psychological, racial, sexual subject positions in the world today. The humanities can speak to significant big questions in life and in the world at large. In a time of globalization, the humanities can speak to challenges as well as help to create global awareness and citizenship. It helps one examine one's own position, oneself in relationship to others, imagining oneself in another's shoes. It relates potentially in our case, the course my wife and I teaching, to strategies of survival in the past relate in some ways to contemporary social issues. Accordingly, when I teach Othello and teach about Iago, and Iago has this wonderful line, "I am not what I am." I mean, it's about reading within the text what that line is about, right? And locating in the text and thinking that it is about his being other people or appearing different, and not being what he is into Othello. But it also is about the sense that he hasn't gotten his position where he wants to be in life, right? I am not what I am. And so I related that to students to think about themselves in their own life. I related a story. In third grade, I was first in a remedial reading class, and I knew I was much better than that. And said, I am not what I am, you know, that I am going to get to a point where, and I did, but that sense for them to think about how that relates to life lessons. And that's, in a sense, what literature can do. And our notion of beyond survival, what we're pushing students to think is beyond, how the text survives beyond, in a sense, what has happened. So Othello, here we are reading it now, and it still has meaning. Martha Nussbaum of Chicago, in her book Not for Profit, argues that the humanities as having or need to have a crucial role in the commitment to a democratic community and social equality. That an aim for the future must be to produce humane, sympathetic, and creative global citizens. And it was interesting hearing these because, and then those people in SUS or SUS committee know that there's resonance there with what we're talking about here and what we want to achieve in terms of at Stanford. A healthy democratic society, she argues, needs independent-minded and creative individuals. Similarly, what I would suggest, humanities enable us to understand potentially what's important in life and think about those and find a sense of a different perspective on a worldview that you held earlier. And what we need to understand is that technology, however vast, is often informed what happens humanistically. They don't work separately. They need somehow to work together. So, is the lecture dead? Well, maybe it's on life support. But the idea, I believe, is that we have the power, the ability, the wherewithal in our will, in our passion for what we do, in the sense of the greatness that is Stanford and all we want it to be, to reinvigorate it, in a sense, to make it anew, to find new ways to deliver information that brings students in and make them part of the process, and yet allow for that sense that we are educating them to the importance of following this line of argument. So I'm looking forward to that challenge, and that is what lies ahead. Thank you. Thank you.